My name is Aparna, and I have the honor and privilege of being the president of the Dalhousie Students' Union. I am also a final year industrial engineering student, which has some cool intersections with healthcare in the Atlantic provinces. I want to take a second to actually talk about international students as a key stakeholder in Canada's post-secondary system, as well as how international students are being impacted by the healthcare crisis that we're seeing right now. As we all know, post-secondary education is a provincial responsibility, but immigration itself is a national responsibility, which leads to some gaps in kind of the care and the consistency of outcomes for international students. And we see that some of these gaps that we're seeing in healthcare affects and impacts international students the most. And I've had to see situations and circumstances over the last few years where dead international student bodies had to be sent home, and I would never wish that tragedy on anyone. With how the tuition rates are progressing, international students are increasingly subsidizing education for post-secondary students across Canada. Canada is able to remain one of the most educated and the most educated country in the OECD, while also having among the highest, tuition rates, because international students are also putting in and investing so much in our system, and also contributing so much to the economy after they graduate and stay here and contribute to the labor force. What is the federal government doing to address that gap?
No, thank you, Aparna. Great question. International students are an incredibly important part of the Canadian system. Being able to educate people from around the world so that they can come and stay and contribute to our communities and our growth, or return home with the extraordinary education they have and help their home country as well. Either way, that's a great thing. And having those connections to the world is something Canada's always done. And it'll always be really important to make sure we are sharing and participating in the global education of people who will be contributing for decades to come in what is increasingly become a very, very small world. However, the first priority of Canadian institutions and Canadian systems are to make sure that we're giving the best possible education to Canadians. Your parents, for the most part, all paid taxes. You've paid into the system, you're part of this system. And that's why what we're focused on is making sure that education is as affordable as possible for all Canadians. That has to be our priority. Now, yes, we are certainly open to bringing in international students, but let's understand something. Your education, for which you're paying very high tuition rates here in Nova Scotia, is still massively subsidized by the government. International students are paying closer to the unsubsidized actual cost of education if government is not paying for it with the tax dollars that Canadians contribute to government for people who presumably grew up in Canada or have been naturalized and therefore committed to Canada for their lives because they wanted to become Canadian citizens and will contribute to this country for decades to come. That has to be our priority. And that's why of all the international students who could potentially come to Canada, would be interested in coming to study in our extraordinary universities, we allow ourselves to say it's going to have to be the ones who can pay for it. It's going to be the ones who can buy and need to buy that private insurance to make sure that they're able to access health care with full insurance that doesn't come from the insurance that is given to Canadians because we all pay for it as a society with our choices. So there is something fundamentally different about international students, which doesn't mean that we should just shrug off the very real and increasingly tragic consequences of the pressures that are being put on international students, from that terrible rise in suicides that we're seeing to the institutions that are increasingly defrauding international students by coming to Canada to discover that it's not a real institution and they paid all this money in tuition and they're not going to come away with any sort of diploma. I mean, there are huge, huge problems of exploitation that we need to be addressing. We will continue to be there to value, to support international students. We need to do a lot more about making sure that we're supporting them in their mental health. We need to do that for all students as well. So it's not a problem unique to them. But fundamentally, there is a difference between Canadians and people who are committed to this country and who are anchored in these communities, going to university and making sure it's as affordable as possible, and saying there are so many international students who would like to come to Canada that we're going to have them pay the actual cost of the education they're going to get, or close to the actual cost of the education they're going to get. Because if we're going to subsidize, well, we're going to start by subsidizing for Canadians and for people who've come and committed to this country. But thank you for your question.